are live on both platforms. Okay, great. Um, so, good evening to everyone who's tuned in. Today's discussion is based on the theme structural transformation and the gender earnings gap in India. We are joined by two eminent speakers. Allow me to introduce them to you. Professor Rosa Abraham is Assistant Professor, Center for Sustainable Employment at Premji University, and Professor Amit Basole is Professor of Economics and Head, Center for Sustainable Employment, Azim Premji University. A very, very warm welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let me start with my first question. One remark you mentioned in your EPW paper is that it is little understood how, and I quote, women's earnings and earnings gap fare over the course of structural transformation. So, as we begin this discussion, could you tell us more about what prompted you to study this particular theme and the methodology that you employed in your analysis?
So, yeah, I think I can come in here. So, I think the statement about little being understood about women's earnings and vis-a-vis structural transformation is really a statement in contrast to how much more we understand about women's employment in the course of structural transformation. So, there's a very famous U hypothesis, which was recently in the news a lot, with called Claudia Golden getting a Nobel Prize in economics. And the U hypothesis basically states that as countries grow and as their manufacturing and services sector develop, initially women will fall out of employment and then over time they'll come back or they'll enter the workforce. So that's the U.
Right.
So there's this very clear relationship, or at least a theorization of what should happen with employment. But a similar theorization or a conceptualization of what happens with regard to earnings of women and earnings of women vis-a-vis men is actually relatively less developed. So this was really what prompted us to look at this particular question of moving beyond just the employment outcomes, but rather also looking at earnings outcomes over the course of structural transformation.
Absolutely. Um, so, in what manner does the access to education impact the gender earnings gap, as you discuss in your paper?
Yeah, so I'll come in on this. So I think the relationship is fairly direct, which is that, and there's a very clear mechanism where as women get more education, they are likely to access jobs across industries that are typically not accessible to them. And they are also going to access occupations. So they might move from low paying occupations to higher paying occupations because of the fact that they are educated. And so, in a sense, that as women are more educated and really as educated as men, then one potential constraint that might have made them earn differently to men is really reduced. So, I think
Right,
that channel is fairly obvious in a sense.
right. And you also mentioned that the sector expands and the women's educational attainment also increases. Women are also more likely to engage with paid employment. Why is that?
Sorry, I didn't get that. Can you repeat that? Yeah.
You mentioned that as the services sector expands and women's educational attainment also increases, women are more likely to also attain paid employment.
Right. So, one thing that happens with employment for women is that a lot of this tends to be unpaid family labor, and a
Right,
lot of this is unpaid family labor in agriculture. So, they are contributing to the output, but they're not really getting a direct payment for this. So,
right.
as services sector expands, what this means is that different kinds of jobs that are not necessarily unpaid family labor
Mhm.
also become available. So this could be tailoring, it could be tutoring, it could be jobs in health and education sectors as well. And
Right,
so that, in a sense, allows women to engage in paid work where they are explicitly getting a salary rather than in some kind of family labor where they often have to share in some profits or earnings that come to the family enterprise as a whole.
absolutely. You also mentioned in the paper that the nature of jobs that are created may be such that it actually exacerbates the pay gap. Could you explain the same with the help of a few examples?
Yeah, I can quickly explain and I'll ask Amit also to come in.
Sure.
So this draws slightly from again Claudia Golden's kind of work. And something that she demonstrated in the context of the US economy was that as the economy grew, the kind of jobs that emerged were jobs that were non-linear with respect to the hours worked. So, for
Right.
example, when I say non-linear, suppose you work 7 hours and you add an additional hour to your work, then you expect your earnings to increase by, say, a certain amount. When it becomes non-linear in hours work, what it means is that the increase in earnings when you move from, say, 7 to 8 is very different from the increase in earnings when you move from, say, 11 to 12 hours. So every additional hour worked, as you increase the hours worked, actually starts to add more and more to your earnings. And Claudia Golden made this very nice contrast between pharmacists and lawyers, and and she found that basically the pharmacy job over time in US became more and more linear in hours work. That every additional hour didn't add anything more. So this kind of homogenized the returns to hours worked across men and women. Whereas lawyers, every additional hour actually increased their earnings far more because this is a kind of work that was also typically inflexible, sometimes has huge demands on the, just the amount of time you invest in that particular job.
Right.
So what happens is that if jobs are this kind of non-linear in hours worked, then they can actually be unfavorable for women who are particularly not in a position to have this kind of flexibility in the amount of time that they can invest into a particular job. So the moment pay and wages are kind of conditional on hours worked and very sensitive to hours worked, women end up bearing the brunt and they end up being on the disadvantaged by that such this kind of a pay structure.
Absolutely.
Amit, if you want to come add, please.
Uh, no, so I think that's so. Only thing I would say is that maybe we'll come back to this also a little bit later. That what Rosa has just said, uh, you know, for your audience also, it should alert them to the fact that when we talk about women's employment and women's earnings,
Right.
a lot of social cultural factors become immediately relevant, in a way that we don't think about when we talk about men's employment, right? So because women are constrained by so many of these other norms, the kinds of jobs they can take up becomes constrained, and that in turn has an impact on their potential to earn, etc. So when we talk about, and in the end when we will discuss policies, policies have to address each step of uh, this process, meaning that it's not enough just to maybe create jobs, but then you also have to relax the constraints so that women can take up those jobs that are being created, and so forth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was just about to come to that, in the sense that it's not enough to just ensure even the earnings gap is met. It's also important to look at the question of access in a much more broader sense, be it women's mobility, women's safety, access to childcare services. All of these factor in when we're considering the wage economy.
Absolutely. So, in a sense, what we are looking at when we are looking at earnings is the end of a long process of selection, discrimination, or of different kinds at different stages, right? So, if you go all the way back to, I mean, you can go all the way back to, in fact, early childhood investments and schooling. Then you go to college education, the kind of college, the kind of streams that girls and boys would choose. Then you go to, marriage markets and decisions there, family responsibility. So each of this is really acting in its own way to give you the end, which is the earnings distribution that we are looking at. But obviously in the paper we don't address all of these issues, but the field as a whole has addressed these different parts of the question.
In one of my previous discussions with another set of speakers, we were talking about data, and we were talking about how data um, really helps you analyze some things better, but it also imposes significant constraints. So, do you think looking at the gender earnings gap from only one lens is also a constraint in such way that it does not allow you to factor in other social or sociological factors? Do you think that is a constraint on study in some ways?
Rosa, do you want to comment on that?
Um, Yeah, I think that, yeah, because of the way data is collected, I think that is one thing to get out of the way, that sometimes we're probably not getting the full sample of women in a sense, right? So not only are we getting all of the women, potentially we're not talking to the women themselves. And sometimes some of the data that is being reported is often being reported by men on behalf for their women. So there's one kind of gap that emerges. But the other kind, coming to what you were asking, which is really that data asks very objective, or what we think is objective and quantifiable information, whereas things like norms are usually things that you can't answer from just simple questions. And what we also found is, even when we try to get at certain norms based questions in the field, when we've done field work, is that respondents are often reluctant to give really their true opinions, right? Because some of those opinions can be fairly controversial. So there is limitations definitely in using this kind of quantitative data. And in fact, something that we are finding with this study is what we call the unexplained component, which is how much of the earnings gap is not because, you can't explain it because men and women have different attributes, like quantifiable attributes. That unexplained component has really increased over time. And one, it's pointing towards data itself being inadequate to capture some of these elements of discrimination and labor market bias. And just that we can't rely on just data to tell us some of the larger mechanisms at play. It can tell us that there are things happening which is not explained by observable attributes, but what are those unobservable attributes? In a sense, we need to look beyond just the quantitative data that we have here.
Yeah, yeah, very well put. Uh, so, how does the convergence between male and female earnings in the top two deciles of the earnings distribution contrast with the persistent gap at the bottom? And what factors contribute to these disparities?
Yeah, Rosa, do you want me to take that?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so just for your audience, in case they haven't looked at the study, the one of the things that it shows, and other people have also commented on this earlier, is that the extent of the male-female earnings gap is not constant across the earnings distribution. So if you look at workers who get lower wages, workers who get higher wages, and ask how do high paying men and women compare? How do lower earning men and women compare? Right? How do men and women compare in higher paying jobs, lower paying jobs? What we find is that the gender wage gap tends to be narrower at the top than at the bottom. Now, there are these two terms that often get thrown around in this context. One is the glass ceiling, and the other is a sticky floor, right?
Yes.
And you'll see kind of them used in the literature. So glass ceiling refers to the fact that women cannot rise above a certain level. It doesn't have to be women, it could be any disadvantaged group, cannot rise above a certain level. So your gap comes from there, and that could be because of overt discrimination or various other things. A sticky floor refers to the fact that people find it difficult to rise up from a certain level. Right? So both of those can occur. And what we are finding here is that at least in the part of the earning distribution that we observe, a sticky floor seems to be more prominent than a glass ceiling. That at the top, men and women seem to earn more similar things. Now that may be because the kinds of jobs are such that it is um, more structured corporate jobs, let's say jobs that are more regulated in terms of pay, so that it's harder to openly discriminate. Women do end up getting paid something that is fairly a standard wage for a certain kind of work, while at the bottom end we're talking about the informal sector where things are not regulated, and it's much easier to think of multiple disadvantages that a woman would face in an informal setting that would uh, result in her getting paid a lot lower than a man in a similar occupation. Now, a caveat here is that going back to the data limitations, we don't observe men and women in exactly the same work. We tried to do that by looking at the industry and occupation, but secondary data limitations means that what we think of as the same occupation and industry could be slightly different because the gender division of labor operates at a very fine level, right? So, for example, to give you, one of the examples from my field work many years ago, even within the embroidery sector where you're embroidering fabric and so on, men and women may do different kinds of embroidery work which get paid different amounts. So that's a very, very super fine distinction, and that happens in other places too. So in the informal sector, you can imagine a wage gap coming from that, and we can't really, address that, right? So the combination of factors that operate there might make the gap worse at the bottom than at the top. Now, the last caveat I will add is that secondary data limitation again means that we don't observe actually the very, very top of the distribution,
Hmm.
the really well-paying corporate jobs and so on. So if there's actually a glass ceiling operating there,
Hmm.
that's not going to show up in the data.
Okay.
Because the vast majority of the workers we observe are much lower than those kinds of corporate jobs.
Hmm. Interesting.
Rosa, please feel free to add if
Yeah, it's all from nothing from my side.
What are the potential drivers behind the evolution of the gender earnings gap during periods of economic development and structural transformation? How do factors such as occupational segregation, childcare responsibilities, and access to equal opportunities contribute to these trends?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that is really worth looking at a lot more carefully, and our paper is just scratching the surface of it, is what you have at the big level is just a very big descriptive fact, which is how much do men earn, how much do women earn.
Yes.
Now, as your question reveals, many things are going to change over time
Hmm.
in terms of both the kinds of job opportunities that become available
Hmm.
and the characteristics of the men and women workers, education wise, cultural norms that enable them to participate more freely, and so on. Yeah? So, the gap over time, the gap itself can be thought of as being composed of variety of changing factors. So Rosa gave the example of how the same size of the gap may be more or less explained by observable characteristics.
Hmm.
So as over time educational attainments converge
Right.
and women and men look more and more similar to each other
Hmm.
in their educational background,
Hmm.
the gap may become more and more unexplained, quote unquote, meaning that we've taken away some of the explanation that education, earlier maybe the gap was because of educational differences,
Right.
but now those educational differences have narrowed.
Right.
So it's about something else. Or earlier, maybe the gap was because there were big industrial segregation things. Women only were in textile work or BD work or something like that. Now, over time, women are in many more industries.
Right.
So that component is going to become less important.
Hmm.
But within an industry, maybe there is a lot of segregation still, and women are still in some kind of work and not in other kinds of work. So again, that nature of that gap, what it is driven by is changing over time. Yeah? And if you look at a really mature industrialized economy like the US or the EU, you'll still find gender wage gaps.
Yes.
But they may not be there because of the reasons that they're there in India, at least some of them, right? So I think a lot more work is needed to see how the process, over time, has changed the nature of the gap.
Right. And I like how interestingly you note the term suitability of roles for women and how that ties in with their roles within the household, and that creates an impact on the gender wage gap. So, could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, maybe Rosa, you want to go on that?
Yeah. So I think, yeah, I think we've used the word suitable, and I think we've always quoted it when put it in quotes when we used it, is to kind of talk also about the norms that operate. So there are certain kinds of jobs that maybe women are less inclined to, or at least socially they are less. Favorable for women. So some kinds of factory floor jobs or certain kinds of construction for that matter are jobs that they wouldn't want. So whereas if you have jobs in education and health, you see more women there, partly because there's a sort of social legitimization of women in those kinds of jobs as against others kinds of jobs. So I think that at some level, there's again this itself has to change, that what is suitable for women versus men. But I think that's a longer process. But one thing that we did see is that these kinds of jobs, in a sense, which are suitable jobs, which is seen in modern services like education, health, your public services, those are
Right.
also industries where the gender gap is actually very narrow and has narrowed over time as well. So it also points towards the fact that this idea of suitability also comes where there is probably less, at least explicit discrimination in a sense. And traditional services, which is actually where you see a lot of women, is an industry where the earning gap has actually been very wide and it has not really changed over time. So, the kind of jobs that traditional services has is your domestic work, as well as, tailoring, small scale, petty jobs, and so on. Now, those are also can be seen as suitable, but then you can see that these are, at least from an earnings perspective, tends to be disadvantages for women. So I think the suitability can work in two ways. On the one hand, it kind of constrains women to certain kinds of disadvantageous jobs, but at the same time, it can also push industries to develop certain kinds of jobs if they want to attract a female labor force.
Yeah. So the question is actually about whether we should create more jobs that are quote unquote suitable for women, or we should consider and perceive women to be quote unquote more suitable for jobs.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that
That's very well
yeah,
put.
that's very well put. Yeah.
Great. Um, so, what are some of the key takeaways from your extensive study of the 5 rounds of the National Sample Survey Office employment and unemployment surveys and the 2 rounds of the periodic labor force survey?
Amit?
Hmm. So maybe I can answer this question, since we have discussed a lot of the paper's findings already. Let me also just alert your audience to the our report from last year, out of which this paper came, the State of Working India report, because what we tried to do in that report was use all of this data that you just mentioned to get at as much as this data will allow us, in a way, to understand trends in female employment and earnings and so on. So we also looked at, for example, how female employment is determined by its her household, a woman's employment, like whether the husband is, how much is the husband earning, because typically, again, suitability turns out also to be a question of supplemental earning and so on, right? That so we've explored the husband earning relationship to women's employment. We've explored mother-in-law's employment status and how that impacts women's employment, and we've also looked at the earnings question. We also looked at, over time, there's been a remarkable increase in salaried work for women in India in
Yes.
about the last 20 years or so. So we've tried to understand, where that is coming from, which sectors has that increase come in, and so forth. So this data is that way quite informative, given the caveats we discussed earlier, about it, and those apply very well. On trying to give us a broad understanding of the trends in women's employment. What it One important limitation of the data that I think we kind of alluded to but didn't, and I want to say that here, is that it's not so good at identifying mechanisms of why things are happening, right? Almost, it's actually almost not. It doesn't give us any idea. So it can tell you trends, it can tell you disparities, and so on. But what are the mechanisms by which women are making these decisions? What are the mechanisms by which the employers are deciding who to employ, who to offer how much wages to? These are all important questions that come up here and which show up in the outcomes. But the data doesn't allow us to answer that. So yeah, so I think our broad takeaways are all to do with the trends. Where are women working? Which sectors? What type of jobs? And what are their earnings disparities vis-a-vis men?
Fair enough. We also have one audience question. Could you distinguish between the term care economy and monetized economy? How can care economy be brought into monetized economy through women empowerment?
Okay. Do you want me to take this, Rosa? Or
I can take a jab at
yeah,
it.
go ahead. Go ahead.
Um, yeah, so I think so. If we were to talk about care economy as care work, which is the domestic sort of labor of women, of caring for the household and for children and so on, as distinguished from a monetized economy, which is where you have to trade goods or services. So this distinction really harks back to the construction of the GDP as a measure, right? So all the things that went into exchange and were sort of sold in exchange for cash or kind is what fed into GDP. And because care work, in a sense, was not traded, it immediately doesn't become part of the GDP, and that's why it's what's seen as a non-monetized economy. Now, to the question of can we and should we or how do we monetize this? Now, there have been methods in economics and to kind of value care work and attach a monetary value to it, which is an important exercise to understand the value of it on its own. But I will say that kind of monetizing, or rather, there's been initiatives to that, we have to pay women, and I think some state governments have done this, that women in kind of care work are given certain transfers. I think we need to view these kind of initiatives with some caution because, in my opinion, a lot of this kind of initiatives can also end up perpetuating ideas and norms around what women should be doing and justifying that those kind of norms and roles and identities. So I
Right.
think that there's one thing, and to the extent that can this lead to empowerment, I don't think simply monetizing because of this, you just end up perpetuating things. That I don't think that's the way to actually empower women. So
Right.
empowerment can be through allowing them the opportunity to take up employment if they wish to. If they, and I'm not saying employment is the only way for empowerment, but at least the access to that opportunity should be available. And simply monetizing the work that they do may not directly lead to empowerment. Amit, if you want to add.
No, no.
That's very well put. Um, Coming back to the methodological question, so do methodological choices such as the use of decomposition techniques significantly influence the understanding of gender earnings gap in India?
Um,
I'm not sure. So any technique will have its own limitations. Do you have anything specific in mind when you could you elaborate maybe?
Just if you could discuss if there are any significant methodological constraints that you faced during the study.
Okay. Well, I would say that it's probably the constraints come more from the nature of the data. In what it allows, what questions it allows you to answer, and we've discussed those limitations before. Method-wise, the decomposition method is a very, very old, simple technique that has been used for years.
Right.
The big limitation, of course, of the technique, if you think about where economics has gone in the last few decades, is that it's not a causal technique. Right?
Hmm.
So it doesn't really answer any causal question like this happens because of that.
Exactly.
It is just a descriptive way of saying, how do I understand this gap in terms of observable characteristics and things that are not observable, explained and unexplained. That's the very simple thing that it allows you to do. It's not useless, it gives you important information.
Right.
But a lot of times people are interested in questions of a causal nature. Will increasing women's education enable them to access better jobs?
Hmm.
Well, that's a much more difficult question to answer. Right? Or even more pertinent to the current debate, if we loosen the cultural norms around women's mobility,
Hmm.
will that increase women's employment?
Hmm.
Well, yes, but if the constraint is not on the supply side but the demand side, meaning that there are no jobs for them to do,
Hmm.
then no matter how much you loosen the norms, increased mobility of women is not going to translate into increased employment for women because there are no jobs for them to do. Right?
Right.
So these are the kinds of causal questions that the present study certainly doesn't answer, and the kind of data that we have used also doesn't allow us to answer that.
Okay. Noted. Uh, what are some of the policy implications of your study? Is there a way in which women can overcome these structural barriers as they join the labor market?
Yeah, so there's a large literature on this, and of course, this study is a very, very modest kind of thing, which doesn't even go into the policy much. But people have thought a lot about this question, and we have some lessons from other countries as well.
Sure.
Uh, See, so again, you can divide up the policies broadly into, are you trying to relax the constraints around women's participation, so norms and so on, and improve the quality of the workforce in terms of education and skills?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you trying to intervene on the labor demand side and create more jobs? Right? These are the two things. And of course, needless to say, policies should be devised on both sides because we have both kinds of problems. We have women facing constraints, we have women not being able to access educational opportunities on par with men, but we also have not enough jobs being created. Um, so where does most of the bang for buck come from? And that depends on who you ask. My personal opinion is that there's a lot to be gained by focusing on labor demand and creating employment opportunities, which then bring women into the workforce, which convince families of the value of women going out and working.
Yes.
And there is indeed work emerging which shows that families are not opposed to women working, but at the margin, they're evaluating, is it worth it? Right? What kind of job is it? What kind of environment is it? How much does it pay? So that worth it, of course, also has to be put in quotes because they would not ask the same question for a man. But how it is they're asking it for women. So creating more good jobs will enable women to participate.
Sure.
The other big place is, of course, investment in public transport and things like that, public safety and public transport, which we know that even if privately households would like women to be mobile, they do have genuine concerns about how is mobility going to happen, is it safe, and so forth. Right? So here's something where policy can help a lot, and with all these experiments with free tickets for buses and those kinds of things, and studies are coming out on how effective that has been in enabling women's mobility.
Yeah.
So I would say focusing on creating jobs, improving public infrastructure, public safety, and so on is very important. Of course, quality of education, etc., is an important thing. But there, my guess is that men are not receiving particularly quality education on average either. So that's something that's a general problem that we have.
I think
Rosa, please. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. I think just to underscore Amit's point about, it really is about creating the jobs. I think one thing that stood out for me is that the period where you see a huge fall in women in employment, so it's fallen from 30% to about 18, 19%. Around in the same period is also where you see of the women in the workforce, there's a doubling in their share in salaried work. So you have this exit of women, but at the same time, the women who remained, or at least the women who've chosen to enter, are
Exactly.
increasingly entering into salary jobs, which, in terms of earnings, are essentially jobs that are better than self-employment or casual wage work. So, if the right kinds of jobs are created and if enough jobs are created, then there is this, women will enter into the workforce. There is social norms, cultural norms. I won't completely, say that these won't exist. But I think there is a huge role for the demand side to actually bring women into the workforce. And
Right.
specifically with regard to the earnings gap, I think certain industries like modern services, which are slightly more regulated, there's more clear regulations at play, there's more institutional support as well, are also the kind of industries that policy should promote because that can also close the earnings gap.
Yeah, excellent remarks by both of you. I mean, it's not only important to create more jobs for women or for the larger mankind, but also think about how we can create conducive conditions to help women participate in that workshop that workforce that they join. Okay, I think with that we can put a wrap to this particular live. Thank you to our patient audience for tuning in, and thank you to our two speakers for sharing all of those valuable insights. You can, of course, go back home and read the article. It's available on our EPW website. And I'd also like to take out a minute to ask you to subscribe to EPW and support us on our social media. Thank you once again, Professor Abraham and Professor Basole.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having us.